Chapter 1: Ernest Shackleton, the Antarctic Hero. Picture you're stuck in the middle of Antarctica. Your ship is crushed like a tin can by massive chunks of ice, and you have 27 men depending on you to get them home alive. The temperature is so cold that your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth, and the nearest civilization is thousands of miles away across the most dangerous ocean on Earth. What do? Well, if you're Ernest Shackleton, you simply refuse to give up and pull off one of the most incredible rescue missions in human history. Ernest Henry Shackleton was born in Ireland in 1874, but his family moved to London when he was 10 years old. Even as a kid, Ernest had adventure running through his veins like hot chocolate on a winter morning. While other children were playing with toys, young Ernest was dreaming about exploring unknown corners of the world. He wasn't the best student in school, but that didn't matter much because his real classroom was going to be the great outdoors. When Ernest turned 16, he made a decision that would change his life forever. Instead of going to university, like most kids from good families, he decided to join the merchant navy. Can you imagine telling your parents that you want to spend your life on ships instead of getting a proper education? His father wasn't thrilled, but Ernest had that special spark that some people are born with, the kind that makes them want to push boundaries and see what's possible. Life at sea wasn't easy. The young Shackleton had to work incredibly hard, learning everything from tying knots that could hold in the strongest storms to navigating by the stars when there was nothing but water in every direction. But Ernest loved every minute of it. He was like a sponge, soaking up knowledge about ships, weather, and most importantly, how to lead people when things get tough. By the time he was in his 20s, Shackleton had already proven himself as someone special. He had a way of making people trust him, even in the most difficult situations. Other sailors would look to him for guidance, not because he was the loudest or the strongest, but because he had this calm confidence that made everyone feel safer. Then came the opportunity that would make him famous. In 1901, Captain Robert Falcon Scott was putting together an expedition to Antarctica, that mysterious continent at the bottom of the world that was still largely unexplored. Antarctica was like the moon of that era, a place so remote and dangerous that only the bravest people even dared to think about going there. When Shackleton heard about the expedition, he knew he had to be part of it. The journey to Antarctica on Scott's ship, the Discovery, was like nothing Shackleton had ever experienced. As they sailed south, the world became stranger and more beautiful with each passing day. Icebergs the size of buildings floated past their ship like ancient cathedrals made of crystal. The water turned from blue to deep green, and then to an almost black color that seemed to absorb all light. But the real adventure began when they reached Antarctica itself. This wasn't just cold. This was a kind of cold that could kill you in minutes if you weren't careful. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed across the ice like a living thing trying to push them back to where they came from. And yet Shackleton found it absolutely magnificent. During this first Antarctic expedition, Shackleton, Scott, and another explorer named Edward Wilson attempted to reach the South Pole. They traveled on foot across the ice, pulling sleds loaded with supplies behind them. Each step was a battle against the cold, the wind, and the thin air that made every breath feel like work. They walked for months, covering hundreds of miles of ice that no human had ever seen before. Unfortunately, they didn't make it to the South Pole on that trip. Shackleton became seriously ill with scurvy, a disease caused by not getting enough vitamin C, and they had to turn back. But instead of being disappointed, Shackleton was more determined than ever. He had tasted the challenge of Antarctica, and it had awakened something deep inside him. When they returned to England, Shackleton was already planning his next adventure. He spent the next few years raising money, gathering supplies, and putting together his own expedition. This wasn't easy. Convincing people to give you money to go to the most dangerous place on Earth requires a special kind of persuasion. But Shackleton had a gift for making people believe in his dreams. In 1907, Shackleton returned to Antarctica with his own expedition on a ship called the Nimrod. This time he was the leader, and he was determined to reach the South Pole. The journey was even more challenging than his first trip. The cold was so intense that their breath would freeze instantly, creating little ice crystals that tinkled when they fell to the ground. Their food froze so hard that they had to chip pieces off with axes. Shackleton and his team made it closer to the South Pole than anyone had ever been before. They came within just 97 miles of their goal, so close they could almost taste victory. But Shackleton made a decision that showed exactly what kind of leader he was. He realized that if they continued to the pole, they might not have enough supplies to make it back alive. So he made the incredibly difficult choice to turn around. When people asked him later why he didn't push on to reach the South Pole, Shackleton gave one of the most beautiful answers in the history of exploration. "I thought you'd rather have a live donkey than a dead lion." He chose the lives of his men over personal glory, and that decision made him more respected than if he had reached the South Pole and lost people in the process. But Shackleton's most incredible adventure was still to come. In 1914, he announced his most ambitious plan yet, the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The goal was to cross the entire continent of Antarctica on foot, something that had never been attempted before. It would be like walking from New York to California, except across ice, in temperatures that could freeze your skin in seconds, with no roads, no shelter, and no way to call for help if something went wrong. Shackleton's ship for this expedition was called the Endurance, and it was specially built to handle the crushing pressure of Antarctic ice. The ship was strong and beautiful, like a wooden fortress designed to carry them safely through the most dangerous waters on Earth. Shackleton carefully chose 27 men to join him on this adventure: scientists, sailors, photographers, and even a stowaway who was so determined to go that Shackleton let him stay. The journey started well enough. The crew was excited. The ship was performing beautifully, and they were making good progress toward Antarctica. But as they got closer to their destination, the ice began to get thicker and more dangerous. What had started as scattered chunks floating in dark water gradually became a solid white landscape that stretched as far as they could see. Then, disaster struck. The Endurance became trapped in the ice. At first, it seemed like a temporary problem. The ice would surely break up and release them soon. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The ship was stuck like a fly in amber, and the ice around them was getting thicker and more dangerous every day. Living on a ship trapped in ice is like being in a very strange kind of prison. The men couldn't go anywhere, but they also couldn't just sit around doing nothing. Shackleton understood that keeping morale high would be the key to survival. He organized games, encouraged the men to continue their scientific work, and made sure everyone had jobs to do. He even allowed some of the men to keep pets. There were cats and dogs on board that became beloved members of the crew. For months, they waited and hoped that the ice would release their ship. They watched the sun disappear for the long Antarctic winter, plunging them into darkness that lasted for months. During this time, the only light came from oil lamps and the incredible displays of aurora, those magical green and purple lights that dance across the polar sky like nature's own light show. But the ice had other plans. Instead of releasing the Endurance, it began to squeeze it. The pressure was incredible. Imagine thousands of tons of ice pressing against the ship from all sides. The wooden hull, no matter how strong it was, couldn't withstand this kind of force. The crew could hear the ship groaning and creaking as it was slowly crushed. Shackleton knew they were in serious trouble. He began preparing for the worst-case scenario, abandoning the ship and surviving on the ice. This meant gathering supplies, preparing the lifeboats, and most importantly, keeping the men's spirits up. Even in this desperate situation, Shackleton never let his crew see him panic or lose hope. Finally, the inevitable happened. The Endurance was crushed beyond repair and began to sink into the icy water. Watching your ship disappear beneath the ice, taking with it your only connection to civilization, must have been one of the most heartbreaking sights imaginable. But Shackleton had prepared for this moment. He had already moved the men and essential supplies onto the ice. Now they were truly on their own, 28 men stranded on a floating ice sheet in the middle of the Antarctic Ocean, with no way to communicate with the outside world and no hope of rescue. The nearest land was hundreds of miles away, and between them and safety lay some of the most dangerous waters on the planet. But Shackleton refused to give up. He knew that panic was their worst enemy, so he immediately began organizing the men for their survival. They set up camp on the ice, creating a small village of tents and supply depots. The men nicknamed their new home Patience Camp because patience was exactly what they were going to need. Life on the ice was like nothing you can imagine. The men were living on a piece of ice that was constantly moving and changing. Sometimes cracks would appear right through the middle of their camp, forcing them to quickly move everything to safety. The cold was so intense that metal would shatter like glass, and any exposed skin would freeze within minutes. For months they lived this way, drifting on their ice floe and hoping it would carry them closer to land. Shackleton made sure that every man had a job and that morale stayed as high as possible. They continued to play games, hold concerts, and even publish a newspaper called the South Polar Times. Can you imagine being stranded on ice and still finding reasons to laugh and celebrate? Finally, after months on the ice, their floe began to break up. It was time for the most dangerous part of their journey, taking to the lifeboats and trying to reach land across the stormy Antarctic seas. The boats were small and overcrowded, and the men were exhausted and weakened by their long ordeal. The journey in the lifeboats was absolutely terrifying. The waves were enormous, sometimes towering over their tiny boats like moving mountains of water. The men had to constantly bail out water to keep from sinking, and they were so cold that ice formed on their clothes and beards. But Shackleton never stopped encouraging them, never stopped believing that they would make it. After 7 horrific days at sea, they finally reached land, a small rocky island called Elephant Island. It wasn't much to look at, just a barren piece of rock sticking out of the ocean. But to Shackleton and his men, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. They were on solid ground for the first time in over a year. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. Elephant Island was uninhabited and far from any shipping routes. No one would ever find them there. Shackleton realized that their only hope was for someone to go get help. So he made another incredibly brave decision. He would take 5 men and sail 800 miles across the stormiest ocean in the world to reach a whaling station on South Georgia Island. The boat they used for this journey was just 22 feet long, smaller than many modern sailboats. They were going to sail it across 800 miles of the most dangerous water on Earth, with no radio, no GPS, and no way to call for help if something went wrong. It was like trying to cross the Atlantic in a bathtub. The journey to South Georgia took 17 days and was filled with constant danger. Waves the size of buildings crashed over their tiny boat, soaking them with freezing water. Ice formed on everything, making the boat heavier and more difficult to control. The men had to take turns staying awake to navigate and to chip ice off the boat to keep it from sinking. When they finally reached South Georgia, they discovered they had landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station was on the other side, separated by mountains that no one had ever crossed before. So Shackleton and two of his companions set off on foot to cross these unknown mountains, while the other three men stayed with the boat. The mountain crossing was like something out of an adventure movie. They had no proper climbing equipment, no detailed maps, and no idea what they would find on the other side. They climbed through snow and ice, sometimes sliding down slopes that could have killed them if they had made one wrong move. At one point, they were so exhausted that they actually tied themselves together and slid down a mountainside, not knowing if they would hit rocks or a cliff at the bottom. After 36 hours of continuous climbing, they finally heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the whistle of the whaling station calling the workers to breakfast. They had made it. They stumbled into the station, looking like wild men after their incredible journey, but they were alive, and they had reached help. The whalers at the station could hardly believe the story Shackleton told them. He immediately began organizing a rescue mission to go back for the men he had left on Elephant Island. But getting back to his stranded crew wasn't easy. The ice conditions were terrible, and it took several attempts before they could reach the island. Finally, on August 30th, 1916, Shackleton returned to Elephant Island. As their rescue ship appeared through the fog, the 22 men who had been stranded there for over 4 months couldn't believe their eyes. Their leader had kept his promise. He had come back for them. The most incredible part of this whole story is that every single man survived. In an era when Antarctic expeditions regularly lost half their crews or more, Shackleton brought everyone home alive. Not one person died during their 22-month ordeal, despite facing conditions that should have killed them all. When they returned to England, Shackleton and his men were heroes. But more than that, they had shown the world what human beings are capable of when they refuse to give up. Shackleton had proven that sometimes the greatest victory isn't reaching your destination, it's bringing everyone home safely. Ernest Shackleton died in 1922 during another Antarctic expedition, but his legacy lives on. He showed us that true leadership isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about never giving up on the people who depend on you. He proved that ordinary human beings can do extraordinary things when they have courage, determination, and faith in each other. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember the story of Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance. Remember that no matter how impossible things might seem, there's always hope as long as you refuse to give up. Sometimes the most badass thing you can do is simply keep going, one step at a time, until you reach safety. Sweet dreams, and may you have the courage of Shackleton in whatever adventures life brings your way. Chapter 2. Marie Curie, the Radiant Genius. In the Redent 3 Geril to Mornbark, and with the work auteur, Bulgari stad tivdestate to tabing, for bluk en tribute. Imagine living in a time when people thought women couldn't understand science, when universities wouldn't even let them through the front door, and when the idea of a female scientist was considered as ridiculous as a fish riding a bicycle. Now imagine being so brilliant, so determined, and so absolutely unstoppable that you not only become one of the greatest scientists in history, but you literally glow in the dark from your discoveries. That was Marie Curie, a woman who didn't just break barriers, she completely obliterated them. Marie Curie was born Maria Sklodowska in Warsaw, Poland in 1867, at a time when her homeland didn't even exist on maps. Poland had been carved up by its powerful neighbors, and Polish people weren't allowed to speak their own language in schools or celebrate their culture openly. But Marie's family was different. They were passionate about learning and absolutely refused to let anyone dim their intellectual light. Her father, Władysław, was a mathematics and physics teacher who filled their small apartment with scientific instruments, books, and most importantly, an infectious love of learning. Her mother, Bronislawa, ran a prestigious school for girls until the Russian authorities shut it down for being too Polish. Can you imagine growing up in a house where science equipment sat next to the dinner plates and where conversations about mathematics were as common as discussions about the weather? Young Maria was like a sponge, soaking up everything her parents could teach her. She learned to read when she was just 4 years old, devouring books faster than her parents could find them. But her childhood wasn't all books and learning. When Maria was 8, tragedy struck her family. Her eldest sister Zofia died of typhus, and just 2 years later, her beloved mother died of tuberculosis. These losses could have broken a young girl's spirit, but instead, they seemed to make Maria even more determined to make the most of her life. The family didn't have much money, especially after these tragedies, but they were rich in something much more valuable: the belief that education could change everything. Maria's father taught her that knowledge was the one thing no government could take away, no oppressor could destroy, and no setback could diminish. But there was a big problem. In Russian-controlled Poland, women weren't allowed to attend university. Can you imagine being incredibly smart, desperately wanting to learn more about science, but being told, "Sorry, you're the wrong gender"? It would be like being a bird and being told you're not allowed to fly. Maria and her sister Branya came up with an ingenious plan. They would take turns supporting each other's education. First, Maria would work and send money to Paris, so Branya could study medicine at the Sorbonne. Then, once Branya was established, she would help Maria pursue her own studies. It was a beautiful example of sisterly love and determination. For several years, Maria worked as a governess for wealthy families, teaching their children while saving every penny she could. But she didn't just work, she also secretly attended what was called the Flying University, an underground network of Polish scholars who held illegal classes in hidden locations around Warsaw. These brave teachers risked imprisonment to keep Polish intellectual life alive. Maria would attend lectures in basements, attics, and private homes, always watching for Russian police who could arrest them all. During this time, Maria also had her first real taste of laboratory work. She managed to get access to a small, poorly equipped lab where she could conduct basic chemistry experiments. The lab was primitive, cold, damp, and barely functional, but to Maria, it was paradise. She spent every free moment there, mixing chemicals, observing reactions, and falling deeply in love with experimental science. Finally, in 1891, when Maria was 24 years old, it was her turn. She had saved enough money, and her sister was ready to help. Maria packed her few belongings and traveled to Paris, where she enrolled at the Sorbonne as Marie, the French version of her name. She had finally made it to one of the world's great universities. Life as a student in Paris was incredibly difficult. Marie lived in a tiny, freezing attic room that was so cold in winter that water would freeze in her wash basin. She often had just enough money for bread and butter, and sometimes she would faint during lectures from hunger and cold. But she was in heaven. For the first time in her life, she could study advanced mathematics and physics without hiding, without fear and without anyone telling her she didn't belong. Mary threw herself into her studies with an intensity that amazed her professors. She would spend entire days in the library, then entire nights in the laboratory. Her dedication was so complete that she sometimes forgot to eat, forgot to sleep, and forgot everything except the beautiful world of science that was opening up before her. Her hard work paid off magnificently. She graduated first in her physics degree and second in her mathematics degree. But more than just good grades, Marie had discovered her calling. She wanted to be a research scientist, to push the boundaries of human knowledge and discover things that no one had ever known before. It was around this time that Marie met Pierre Curie, a brilliant physicist who was 8 years older than her. Their meeting was like something out of a romantic movie, except instead of bonding over poetry or music, they fell in love over conversations about magnetism and crystallography. Pierre was immediately struck by Marie's intelligence and passion for science. Here was a woman who could not only understand his work, but contribute to it as an equal partner. They married in 1895, and it was one of the greatest scientific partnerships in history. Pierre and Marie weren't just husband and wife, they were intellectual soulmates who shared everything: their laboratory, their discoveries, their dreams, and their absolute dedication to understanding the natural world. Marie's greatest adventure began in 1896 when she decided to investigate a mysterious phenomenon that had just been discovered by Henri Becquerel. He had found that certain materials gave off invisible rays that could pass through solid objects and fog photographic plates. Nobody understood what these rays were or where they came from. They were a complete mystery. Most scientists of the time thought this was just a curious oddity, not worth much attention. But Marie had a different feeling. She sensed that these mysterious rays might be the key to understanding something fundamental about the nature of matter itself. She decided to make this phenomenon the subject of her doctoral research, not knowing that this decision would change not just her life, but the entire course of scientific history. Working in a converted shed that served as their laboratory, a building so cold and damp that it was barely fit for storing potatoes, let alone conducting groundbreaking research, Marie began her investigation. The shed had a dirt floor, a leaking roof, and no proper heating. In winter, the temperature inside was often below freezing. It was hardly the kind of place you'd expect world-changing discoveries to be made. But Marie didn't care about the conditions. She was like a detective following the most important clues in history. She began testing different materials to see which ones gave off these mysterious rays. She used an instrument called an electrometer, invented by Pierre and his brother, which could detect even tiny amounts of electrical activity. What Marie discovered was revolutionary. She found that the intensity of the rays depended only on the quantity of the element present, not on what chemical compounds it formed. This suggested that the rays were an atomic property, something that came from the atoms themselves. She coined the term radioactivity to describe this phenomenon, a word we still use today. But Marie's most incredible discovery was yet to come. She found that some materials were much more radioactive than they should have been based on the known elements they contained. This could only mean one thing. These materials contained unknown elements, elements that no one had ever identified before. Marie and Pierre decided to isolate these mysterious new elements. What followed was one of the most heroic efforts in the history of science. They obtained tons of pitchblendy, a uranium ore that showed high levels of radioactivity. Then, working in their freezing shed, they began the incredibly laborious process of separating the ore into its component elements. This wasn't delicate laboratory work with tiny test tubes. This was industrial-scale chemistry done by hand. Marie would stir huge vats of boiling ore with iron rods, nearly as tall as she was. The work was backbreaking, dangerous, and seemingly endless. They processed literally tons of pitchblende, boiling it, dissolving it in acids, filtering it, and crystallizing it over and over again. The work took 4 years. 4 years of stirring, boiling, filtering, and crystallizing. 4 years of working in a shed so cold that their notebooks froze to their hands. 4 years of handling materials that were slowly but surely damaging their health, though they didn't know it at the time. But finally, they succeeded. In 1902, Marie isolated 1/10 of a gram of pure radium chloride, a tiny amount of a completely new element that glowed with its own mysterious light. When they turned off the lights in their laboratory at night, the radium would shine with a beautiful blue-green glow, like trapped starlight. Pierre and Marie would sometimes sneak into their laboratory at night, just to look at their glowing test tubes. Pierre once said it was like having fairy lights in their lab. They had no idea that this beautiful glow was actually a sign of the dangerous radiation that was slowly damaging their bodies. The discovery of radium made Marie famous around the world. In 1903, she became the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, sharing the physics prize with Pierre and Henri Becquerel for their work on radioactivity. But even this incredible honor came with a typical dose of sexism. The Nobel Committee initially planned to honor only Pierre and Becquerel, completely ignoring Marie's crucial contributions. It was only because Pierre threatened to refuse the prize unless Marie was included that she received the recognition she deserved. Life seemed perfect for Marie. She had made groundbreaking discoveries, won the highest honors in science, and was working alongside the love of her life. But tragedy was waiting around the corner. In 1906, Pierre was killed in a traffic accident in Paris. He was crossing a busy street in the rain when he was struck by a horse-drawn wagon. Marie was devastated. She had lost not just her husband, but her closest collaborator, her intellectual equal, and her best friend. Many people expected Marie to retire from science and focus on raising their 2 young daughters. That's what widows were supposed to do in those days. But Marie had different ideas. She took over Pierre's teaching position at the Sorbonne, becoming the first female professor in the university's 650-year history. She also continued their research, determined to carry on the work they had started together. In 1911, Marie won her second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for isolating pure radium. She became the first person ever to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, a record that still stands today. But even this triumph was marred by controversy. Some newspapers attacked her for having a relationship with a younger scientist, and the Nobel Committee actually suggested she not come to Stockholm to accept the prize. Marie's response was magnificent. She went anyway and gave a brilliant lecture about her work. During World War I, Marie saw another way to use her scientific knowledge to help humanity. She realized that X-ray equipment could save lives by helping battlefield doctors locate bullets and shrapnel in wounded soldiers. So she developed mobile X-ray units, which she called Petites Curies, and drove them to the front lines herself. Can you picture this small, determined woman driving a truck full of X-ray equipment through war zones, dodging shells and bullets to help wounded soldiers? Marie personally X-rayed over 1 million wounded men during the war, probably saving countless lives. She never asked for recognition or payment for this work. She just saw a need and filled it. After the war, Marie became an international celebrity and used her fame to promote science and peace. She traveled around the world, giving lectures and raising money for scientific research. She also established the Radium Institute in Paris, which became one of the world's leading centers for nuclear physics and chemistry. But Marie's years of handling radioactive materials were taking their toll. She began to suffer from health problems that we now know were caused by radiation exposure. Her fingers were scarred and painful from handling radioactive substances, and she often felt tired and weak. The notebooks she used during her radium research are still radioactive today, more than a century later, and are stored in lead-lined boxes. Despite her declining health, Marie continued working almost until the end of her life. She died in 1934 from aplastic anemia, almost certainly caused by her long exposure to radiation. But she had lived to see her discoveries revolutionize medicine, physics, and chemistry. Radioactive substances were being used to treat cancer, atomic theory had been transformed, and the door had been opened to the nuclear age. Marie Curie's story is one of the most inspiring in all of human history. She faced discrimination, poverty, tragedy, and countless obstacles, but she never gave up on her passion for discovery. She showed that genius has no gender, that determination can overcome almost any barrier, and that the pursuit of knowledge is one of the most noble things a human being can do. But perhaps most importantly, Marie proved that science isn't just about memorizing facts or following procedures. It's about curiosity, persistence, and the courage to explore the unknown. She literally glowed with the light of discovery, and that light continues to illuminate the path for scientists today. Marie Curie didn't just break the glass ceiling, she melted it with the radiant heat of her intellect and determination. She remains the only person to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, and her discoveries laid the foundation for everything from nuclear medicine to atomic energy. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Marie Curie in her freezing laboratory, stirring those enormous vats of pitchblende, never knowing if her experiments would work, but never giving up. Think about how she turned a tiny glowing sample of radium into a revolution that changed the world. And remember that inside each of us is the same curiosity and determination that made Marie Curie one of the most badass humans who ever lived. Her legacy glows on, inspiring new generations of scientists to push the boundaries of what's possible, to ask the difficult questions, and to never stop searching for answers. In the beautiful, mysterious glow of radium, Marie Curie found not just a new element, but a new way of understanding the universe itself. Chapter 3. Witold Pilecki, the volunteer who walked into hell. Sometimes the most incredible acts of bravery happen in complete darkness, carried out by people whose names history almost forgot. Imagine volunteering to get yourself arrested and sent to the most notorious concentration camp in Nazi Germany, not because you were forced to, not because you had no choice, but because you wanted to organize a resistance movement from the inside and report to the world about the horrors happening there. This sounds like something from a movie that would be too unbelievable to be true, but it's exactly what one Polish cavalry officer named Witold Pilecki decided to do. Witold Pilecki was born in 1901 in a part of Poland that was then controlled by Russia. Even as a young boy, he grew up understanding that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. His family had a long tradition of resisting foreign occupation. They were the kind of people who would rather face punishment than bow down to injustice. When Pilecki was just a teenager, he joined the Polish military during World War I, fighting for his country's independence. Can you imagine being 16 years old and deciding to join a war, But that was the kind of person Pilecki was, someone who couldn't stand by and watch when his homeland was in danger. After Poland regained its independence, Pilecki seemed to settle into a peaceful life. He got married to a wonderful woman named Maria, had 2 children, and ran a small farm in the countryside. He was active in his community, helping to start a local fire department and organizing agricultural cooperatives. To his neighbors, he probably seemed like just another hard-working farmer trying to make a good life for his family. But beneath this quiet exterior was a man with an unshakable moral compass and a willingness to sacrifice everything for what he believed was right. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, starting World War II, Pilecki didn't hesitate for a moment. He immediately joined the Polish resistance, helping to form one of the first underground organizations to fight against the German occupation. The situation in occupied Poland was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Nazis didn't just want to conquer Poland, they wanted to destroy Polish culture, Polish identity, and the Polish people themselves. They closed schools, banned the Polish language, and began systematically murdering intellectuals, priests, and anyone who might lead resistance efforts. It was cultural genocide on a massive scale. Pilecki and his fellow resistance fighters began organizing secret networks to fight back. They smuggled weapons, rescued prisoners, and conducted sabotage operations against German forces. But as the months passed, disturbing rumors began to reach the Polish underground. People were disappearing into German concentration camps and never coming back. Stories filtered out about a particularly horrific place called Auschwitz, but nobody really understood what was happening there. The Polish resistance leaders desperately needed information. What exactly was going on in these camps? How many people were being held there? Was there any way to help them escape or resist? Without reliable intelligence, they were fighting blind against an enemy whose capacity for evil they couldn't even imagine. That's when Witold Pilecki made a decision that was so audacious, so dangerous, and so completely crazy that it takes your breath away. He volunteered to get himself deliberately arrested and sent to Auschwitz so he could organize resistance from inside the camp and report back about what was really happening there. Think about this for a moment. Pilecki had a loving wife and 2 young children. He had a safe hiding place where he could have continued fighting with the underground. He could have chosen any number of less dangerous ways to serve his country. Instead, he chose to walk voluntarily into what he suspected might be hell on earth, with no guarantee that he would ever see his family again. In September 1940, exactly 1 year after Germany invaded Poland, Pilecki put his plan into action. During a German roundup in Warsaw, he deliberately allowed himself to be caught. He used false identity papers under the name Tomasz Serafiński, so that if something happened to him, his real family wouldn't be targeted for revenge. The journey to Auschwitz was a preview of the horrors to come. Pilecki and nearly 2,000 other prisoners were packed into cattle cars like animals, with no food, no water, and barely any air to breathe. Many men died during the journey, and by the time they reached Auschwitz, everyone was weak, terrified, and barely alive. But nothing could have prepared Pilecki for what he found when the train doors opened at Auschwitz. The camp was designed to break human beings completely, to strip away every shred of dignity, hope, and humanity until nothing was left but empty shells waiting to die. The prisoners were immediately beaten with clubs and whips as they stumbled off the trains. Guards screamed at them in German, herding them like cattle toward the camp entrance. Above the gate was a sign that read, "Arbeit macht frei," work makes you free. It was a cruel lie, as most prisoners who entered Auschwitz would never leave alive. Pilecki was assigned prisoner number 4859. From that moment on, he was no longer a person with a name. He was just a number in the Nazi system of dehumanization. His head was shaved, he was given a striped prison uniform that barely fit, and he was assigned to a barracks with dozens of other prisoners who slept on wooden bunks with no mattresses or blankets. The daily routine at Auschwitz was designed to kill people slowly. Prisoners were awakened before dawn and forced to stand for hours during roll call, no matter what the weather. They were given tiny portions of watery soup and stale bread that provided nowhere near enough nutrition to sustain a human being doing hard labor. Then they were marched to work sites where they were forced to carry heavy stones, build roads, or work in factories until they collapsed from exhaustion. But the physical brutality was only part of the horror. The psychological torture was even worse. Guards would randomly select prisoners to be beaten or killed, just to terrorize the others. They would force prisoners to watch executions and punish anyone who showed emotion. They created a system where prisoners had to compete with each other for tiny scraps of food or slightly better work assignments, turning victims against each other instead of against their captors. Most people who found themselves in this nightmare would have focused solely on their own survival, and who could blame them? Every moment in Auschwitz was a battle just to stay alive for one more day. But Pilecki was different. Even in this hell, he never forgot his mission. Within just a few weeks of arriving at Auschwitz, Pilecki began carefully identifying other prisoners who might be willing to resist. This was incredibly dangerous. If the guards discovered any kind of organized resistance, they would torture and kill everyone involved. But Pilecki understood that resistance was the only way to maintain human dignity in a place designed to destroy it. He started small, creating tiny groups of prisoners who would share food with the weakest, pass along information about what was happening in different parts of the camp, and maintain each other's morale through the darkest moments. These weren't grand acts of rebellion, they were small gestures of humanity that helped people remember they were still human beings, not just numbers. Gradually, Pilecki's network grew. He recruited prisoners from different nationalities and backgrounds, creating a secret organization that they called the Union of Military Organizations. The group had several goals: to maintain morale and human dignity among the prisoners, to sabotage German operations when possible, to prepare for a potential uprising if the opportunity arose, and most importantly, to document what was happening at Auschwitz and get information to the outside world. Getting information out of Auschwitz seemed almost impossible. The camp was surrounded by electrified fences, guard towers, and patrols of German soldiers with attack dogs. Mail was heavily censored, and any prisoner caught trying to communicate with the outside world would be tortured and killed. But Pilecki was incredibly resourceful. He established contact with Polish civilians who worked in the camp or lived nearby. Some of these brave people were willing to smuggle messages out, hidden in the most creative places, sewn into clothes, baked into loaves of bread, or memorized and passed along verbally. Through this network, Pilecki began sending detailed reports about Auschwitz to the Polish resistance in Warsaw. These reports were the first reliable information the outside world received about what was really happening in the Nazi concentration camps. Pilecki documented the systematic murder of prisoners, the horrific medical experiments being conducted on human beings, the gas chambers that were being built to kill people more efficiently, and the industrial scale of the Nazi genocide. His reports eventually made their way to the Polish government in exile in London, and from there to the Allied governments. For the first time, world leaders had detailed first-hand accounts of the Holocaust as it was happening. Pilecki's intelligence was so accurate and so comprehensive that it became one of the primary sources of information about Nazi war crimes. But sending reports wasn't enough for Pilecki. He also began planning for a potential uprising. He knew that the prisoners couldn't fight their way out of Auschwitz without outside help, but he hoped that if the Polish resistance or Allied forces could coordinate an attack from outside while prisoners rebelled from within, they might be able to liberate the camp. For 2.5 years, Pilecki lived this double life. During the day, he was prisoner for Tanchede 59, carrying stones and enduring beatings like any other inmate. But at night, he was the commander of a secret resistance network that was growing stronger every month. He recruited new members, planned sabotage operations, and continued sending intelligence reports to the outside world. The psychological strength this required is almost impossible to imagine. Every day, Pilecki watched people die from starvation, disease, and execution. He saw the gas chambers being built and the crematoria being expanded to handle more bodies. He lived with the constant knowledge that he could be discovered and killed at any moment, and yet he never gave up hope, never stopped fighting, and never lost sight of his mission. In 1942, Pilecki learned that the Polish resistance had decided not to attempt an uprising at Auschwitz. They felt it would be too costly and unlikely to succeed. Pilecki was devastated by this decision, but he understood the reasoning. The resistance had limited resources and couldn't risk everything on what might be a suicide mission. Realizing that an outside rescue wasn't coming, Pilecki made another bold decision. In April 1943, after nearly 3 years in Auschwitz, he decided to escape. He had learned everything he could about the camp's operations. His resistance network was well established and could continue without him, and he felt he could be more effective fighting from the outside. Escaping from Auschwitz was considered nearly impossible. The camp was designed like a fortress, and very few prisoners had ever successfully gotten away. But Pilecki had been planning his escape for months, carefully studying the guards' routines, the layout of the camp, and the best routes to safety. On the night of April 26, 1943, Pilecki and 2 other prisoners put their plan into action. They were working at a bakery outside the main camp when they overpowered a guard, stole his weapons, and made a run for it. German soldiers and dogs pursued them through the Polish countryside, but somehow they managed to stay ahead of their pursuers. After several days of traveling at night and hiding during the day, Pilecki finally reached safety. He had done the impossible. He had walked voluntarily into Auschwitz and walked back out alive, carrying with him information that would help the world understand the true scope of Nazi crimes. But Pilecki's war wasn't over. As soon as he reached the Polish resistance, he began pushing for military action to liberate Auschwitz. He wrote detailed reports about the camp's defenses and proposed specific plans for how an attack might succeed. But by 1943, the Allies were focused on other military priorities, and Pilecki's desperate pleas for action went unanswered. Meanwhile, the killing at Auschwitz continued and even intensified. The gas chambers that Pilecki had reported on were now operating at full capacity, murdering thousands of people every day. Over 1 million people would eventually die at Auschwitz, and Pilecki knew that many of them might have been saved if the world had acted on his intelligence sooner. After his escape, Pilecki continued fighting in the Polish resistance. He participated in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, when the Polish underground tried to liberate their capital city from German occupation. The uprising failed after 63 days of fighting, and Pilecki was captured and sent to a German prisoner of war camp. But this was a conventional POW camp, not a concentration camp, and the conditions were far better than what he had endured at Auschwitz. When the war ended in 1945, Pilecki might have expected to be treated as a hero. After all, he had voluntarily entered the most notorious Nazi concentration camp, organized resistance from within, provided crucial intelligence to the Allies, and fought bravely throughout the war. But history had more cruelty in store for this remarkable man. Poland was now controlled by the Soviet Union, and the communist government viewed Pilecki's loyalty to the pre-war Polish government and his Western connections with suspicion. Instead of being honored as a war hero, he was arrested by the communist secret police in 1947 and charged with espionage and working for Western intelligence. The trial was a mockery of justice. Pilecki was tortured and forced to confess to crimes he hadn't committed. The same man who had voluntarily walked into Auschwitz to fight against tyranny was now being persecuted by a different tyrannical system. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed by the communist authorities. For decades, Pilecki's story was suppressed by the communist government in Poland. His name was erased from history books. His reports about Auschwitz were classified, and his family lived under constant surveillance. It was as if the authorities wanted to pretend that this inconvenient hero had never existed. It wasn't until after the fall of communism in 1989 that Pilecki's true story began to emerge. Historians gained access to previously classified documents and began piecing together the incredible tale of the man who had volunteered for Auschwitz. His intelligence reports were published, his resistance activities were documented, and slowly, the world began to understand what this remarkable man had accomplished. Today, Witold Pilecki is finally recognized as one of the greatest heroes of World War II. His reports from Auschwitz are considered among the most important documents of the Holocaust, providing detailed first-hand accounts of Nazi war crimes. His resistance network helped hundreds of prisoners survive and maintained hope in the darkest of places. But perhaps most importantly, Pilecki's story reminds us of the incredible power of individual moral courage. He shows us that even in the most hopeless circumstances, even when facing the most powerful and evil forces in history, one person with enough determination can make a difference. Pilecki didn't have superpowers or special weapons. He was just an ordinary man with an extraordinary sense of right and wrong. He saw injustice and couldn't stand by and do nothing. He saw people suffering and felt compelled to help them, even at enormous personal cost. In a world that often seems dominated by selfishness and moral cowardice, Pilecki's example shines like a beacon. He reminds us that we all have choices to make when confronted with evil. We can look the other way, we can make excuses for why it's not our problem, or we can decide to act. Pilecki chose to act again and again, even when action meant walking into hell itself. He chose to risk everything for people he didn't know, for a cause greater than himself, and for the simple principle that some things are worth any sacrifice. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Witold Pilecki lying on his wooden bunk in Auschwitz, surrounded by suffering and death, but never giving up hope. Think about how he turned that place of ultimate despair into a center of resistance and human dignity. Remember that even in the darkest circumstances, there's always a choice to be made between giving up and fighting on. Pilecki's courage didn't come from being fearless. It came from being afraid, but acting anyway. It came from understanding that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for glory or recognition, but simply because they need to be fought. And sometimes the most badass thing you can do is walk voluntarily into hell, knowing that someone needs to bear witness, Someone needs to resist, and someone needs to never stop believing that light can overcome darkness. Sweet dreams, and may you have even a fraction of Witold Pilecki's moral courage when life calls upon you to make difficult choices. His legacy reminds us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to let evil triumph without a fight. Chapter 4: Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people. Picture this. You're a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, born into slavery in a country that considers you property rather than a human being. You can't read or write, you have no money, and the law says you belong to another person like a piece of furniture. The punishment for trying to escape is brutal whipping or even death. Now imagine not only escaping from this system, but going back again and again, 19 times, to lead other people to freedom with a bounty of $40,000 on your head. That's about $1 million in today's money. This isn't a fairy tale or a superhero story. This is the real life of Harriet Tubman, one of the most fearless and determined people who ever lived. Harriet Tubman was born around 1822 on a plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland. Nobody bothered to keep exact records of when enslaved children were born. After all, they were considered property, not people. She was originally named Araminta Ross, but everyone called her Minty. Her parents, Ben Ross and Harriet Green, were both enslaved, which meant that little Minty was born into bondage with no legal rights and no hope of freedom. Life on a plantation was brutally hard, even for a child. Minty started working when she was just 5 years old, first as a house servant and later in the fields. She was often hungry, always tired, and frequently beaten for the smallest mistakes. Enslaved children didn't get to go to school, play with toys, or enjoy the carefree days that childhood should bring. Instead, they worked from dawn to dusk, learning early that their lives belonged to someone else. When Minty was about 13 years old, something happened that would change her forever. She was in a store when another enslaved person tried to run away. The overseer demanded that Minty help restrain the escaping person, but she refused. The overseer was so angry that he threw a heavy iron weight at her head, fracturing her skull and nearly killing her. For months, Minty lay unconscious, hovering between life and death. When she finally recovered, she had changed in ways that went far beyond the physical scar on her forehead. The head injury left her with a condition that caused her to suddenly fall into deep sleeps at unexpected moments for the rest of her life. But it also seemed to awaken something powerful within her, a direct connection to God, and an unshakable belief that she was meant for something greater than slavery. From that moment on, Minty began having vivid dreams and visions that she believed came directly from God. In these visions, she saw landscapes she had never visited, paths through forests she had never walked, and most importantly, she saw enslaved people walking toward freedom. She began to understand that she had been chosen for a special purpose, to lead her people out of bondage, just like Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt. As Minty grew into a young woman, she became known for her incredible strength and determination. Unlike many house servants, she chose to work in the fields because the outdoor labor made her strong and gave her knowledge of the countryside that would prove invaluable later. She could chop wood like a man, knew every path and stream for miles around, and developed an almost supernatural ability to move through the wilderness without being detected. Around 1844, Minty married John Tubman, a free black man, and took his last name. She also changed her first name to Harriet, in honor of her mother. Marriage should have been a happy time, but Harriet lived with the constant fear that she could be sold away from her husband at any moment. In the world of slavery, Families meant nothing to the people who owned human beings. Enslaved people were bought and sold like cattle, with no regard for the relationships they formed. That fear became reality in 1849, when Harriet learned that she and some of her family members were going to be sold to plantations in the Deep South. Being sold south was one of the most terrifying fates that could befall an enslaved person. The plantations in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi were notorious for their brutal conditions and early death rates. Very few people who were sold south ever saw their families again. Harriet faced an agonizing choice. She could accept her fate and go quietly to what might be her death, or she could risk everything in an attempt to escape. When she told her husband John about her plans, he refused to come with her and even threatened to turn her in to their master. This betrayal broke Harriet's heart, but it also strengthened her resolve. If she couldn't count on her husband to support her quest for freedom, she would have to find the courage within herself. On a dark night in September 1849, Harriet made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She left the only home she had ever known, walking away from her husband, her family, and everything familiar. She had no map, no money, and no clear idea of how to reach the free states in the north. All she had was her faith in God, her knowledge of the countryside, and an unbreakable determination to be free. The journey to freedom was a nightmare of danger and uncertainty. Harriet had to travel almost entirely at night, hiding in forests, swamps, and barns during the day. She followed the North Star and the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and brave people who helped enslaved people escape to freedom. The Underground Railroad wasn't actually a railroad at all, but rather a loose collection of abolitionists, freed slaves, and sympathetic whites who risked their own lives to help others reach freedom. Every step of Harriet's journey was fraught with danger. Slave catchers patrolled the roads with bloodhounds, trained to track down escaped slaves. Rewards were posted for her capture, and anyone who helped her could face heavy fines or imprisonment. Even free black people in the North weren't truly safe. The Fugitive Slave Act allowed slave catchers to kidnap free blacks and claim they were escaped slaves. But somehow, after traveling nearly 100 miles, mostly on foot, Harriet made it to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a free state where slavery was illegal. When she crossed that invisible line from slavery to freedom, she later described the feeling. I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. Most people who successfully escaped slavery were content to start new lives in freedom, trying to blend in and avoid drawing attention to themselves. After all, they were still at risk of being captured and returned to slavery. But Harriet was different. As she stood in Philadelphia, breathing free air for the first time in her life, she made a decision that seemed impossible. She would go back south and help other enslaved people escape. I was a stranger in a strange land, she later said. My father, my mother, my brothers and sisters, and friends were in Maryland, but I was free, and they should be free. This wasn't just compassion, it was a calling that she believed came directly from God. In December 1850, just over a year after her own escape, Harriet returned to Maryland on her first rescue mission. Her goal was to bring her sister Mary Ann and Mary Ann's family to freedom. The journey was incredibly dangerous. Returning to slave territory meant risking capture, torture, and death. But Harriet had discovered something about herself during her own escape. She had an almost supernatural ability to avoid capture and guide people safely through the most dangerous situations. That first rescue mission was a complete success. Harriet managed to lead her sister's family safely to Philadelphia without being detected. Word of her success spread quickly through the enslaved communities of Maryland, and soon people were calling her Moses, the biblical figure who had led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. Over the next decade, Harriet would make 19 trips back into slave territory, each one more dangerous than the last, as the rewards for her capture grew larger and the authorities became more determined to stop her. She developed an intricate network of safe houses, secret signals, and trusted allies who helped her move people along the Underground Railroad. Harriet's methods were both brilliant and terrifying. She always traveled in winter when the nights were longest, giving her more hours of darkness to move her groups. She carried a pistol and wasn't afraid to use it, not just against slave catchers, but also against any of her passengers who got cold feet and wanted to turn back, potentially exposing the entire group to capture. "Dead folks tell no tales," she would say grimly. Harriet understood that the success of her missions and the lives of everyone in her group depended on complete commitment. There was no halfway measure when it came to freedom. You were either all in or you could doom everyone. She used ingenious disguises and deceptions to avoid recognition. Sometimes she dressed as an old woman, sometimes as a man. She would carry chickens or other farm animals to make herself look like a field worker going to market. Once, when she spotted her former master on a train platform, she quickly released some chickens she was carrying and chased after them, bent over and acting like a confused old woman. Her former master looked right at her, but didn't recognize the strong, confident woman he had once owned. Harriet also used her mysterious sleeping condition to her advantage. She would tell people that when she suddenly fell asleep during the day, she was receiving visions from God about the safest routes to take and the dangers to avoid. Whether these visions were real spiritual messages or the result of her brain injury, they seemed to work. Harriet never lost a single person on any of her missions. The risks she took were absolutely staggering. By the 1850s, there was a $40,000 bounty on her head, an enormous sum that would be worth over $1 million today. Slave catchers and bounty hunters were actively searching for her throughout the South. Wanted posters with her description were nailed to trees and buildings across Maryland. Despite all this, she kept going back. Her rescue missions became increasingly bold and complex. She would sometimes lead groups of 10 or 15 people at a time, including elderly people and small children who couldn't move quickly or quietly. She developed a system of coded songs and signals that allowed her to communicate with enslaved people on plantations, letting them know when she was in the area and when they should be ready to leave. One of her most daring rescues involved her own parents. Ben and Harriet Ross were getting old, and Harriet was terrified that they would die in slavery, but they were too elderly to make the grueling journey on foot that her other rescues had required. So Harriet came up with an audacious plan. She stole a horse and wagon, disguised herself as a man, and drove right onto the plantation where her parents lived. In broad daylight, she loaded her parents into the wagon and drove them to freedom, pretending to be a young man helping an elderly couple move their belongings. Harriet's reputation grew beyond the enslaved communities. Abolitionists in the North began to recognize her as one of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad. She spoke at anti-slavery meetings, sharing her stories and inspiring others to join the fight against slavery. Despite having no formal education, Harriet was a powerful and compelling speaker who could move audiences to tears with her accounts of life in bondage and the journey to freedom. When the Civil War began in 1861, Harriet saw an opportunity to strike an even bigger blow against slavery. She offered her services to the Union Army, not just as a nurse or cook like many other women, but as a spy and scout. Her knowledge of Southern geography, her network of contacts in enslaved communities, and her ability to move undetected through enemy territory made her incredibly valuable to Union forces. Harriet became the first woman to lead an armed expedition during the Civil War. In June 1863, she guided Union gunboats up the Combahee River in South Carolina, helping to destroy Confederate supply lines and rescue over 700 enslaved people in a single operation. The sight of Harriet Tubman leading Union soldiers and newly freed slaves must have been one of the most powerful symbols of the war's true meaning. Throughout the war, Harriet served as a spy, scout, and nurse, working tirelessly to support the Union cause and help newly freed slaves adjust to their freedom. She was one of the few people who truly understood what freedom meant to people who had lived their entire lives in bondage. After the war ended and slavery was officially abolished, Harriet could finally rest from her dangerous work. She settled in Auburn, New York, where she had bought a small house for her parents. But retirement wasn't really in Harriet's nature. She continued to fight for civil rights, women's suffrage, and support for elderly freed slaves who had nowhere else to go. In her later years, Harriet established a home for elderly African Americans in Auburn. Even though she had never learned to read or write, she understood the importance of education and worked to establish schools for freed slaves. She remained active in the fight for women's rights, understanding that the struggle for equality wasn't over just because slavery had ended. Harriet Tubman died in 1913, having lived to see slavery abolished but not long enough to see women gain the right to vote. At her funeral, the honor guard from a local veterans post fired a salute in recognition of her service during the Civil War. The woman who had been born a piece of property died as a recognized American hero. But Harriet's true legacy isn't in the honors she received late in life. It's in the approximately 70 people she personally led to freedom and the countless others she inspired to seek their own liberation. She proved that one person with enough courage and determination can change the world, one rescued family at a time. What made Harriet Tubman so incredibly badass wasn't just her physical courage, though she certainly had that in abundance. It was her moral courage, her refusal to accept injustice, even when fighting it meant risking everything. She could have stayed safely in Philadelphia after her own escape, building a quiet life in freedom. Instead, she chose to go back into danger again and again because she couldn't bear the thought of others suffering in slavery while she lived in freedom. Harriet also embodied a different kind of strength than the loud, boastful kind we often see celebrated. Her power came from quiet determination, careful planning, and absolute faith in her mission. She didn't need to announce her greatness. Her actions spoke louder than any words could. Perhaps most remarkably, Harriet never let the brutality she experienced turn her into a brutal person. Despite being whipped, beaten, and treated like an animal for the first 27 years of her life, she remained deeply compassionate and committed to helping others. She could have easily become bitter and angry, but instead she channeled her experiences into a force for liberation and hope. In a world that told her she was worthless, Harriet Tubman proved her infinite worth. In a system designed to break her spirit, she became unbreakable. In a society that tried to make her invisible, she became impossible to ignore. She took the name Moses and made it her own, leading her people not across a sea, but through forests and swamps toward the promised land of freedom. As you drift off to sleep tonight, Think about Harriet Tubman moving silently through the Maryland woods on a cold winter night, leading a group of terrified but hopeful people toward freedom. Think about her standing in Philadelphia, breathing free air for the first time, but already planning to go back and help others experience that same moment of liberation. Remember that Harriet didn't start with advantages. She couldn't read, she had no money, and she faced laws and systems designed to keep her powerless. But she had something that no one could take away, an unshakable belief that freedom was worth any risk, and that no one should have to suffer in bondage while she had the power to help them. Harriet Tubman reminds us that heroism isn't about being perfect or having special powers. It's about seeing something wrong in the world and refusing to accept it. It's about using whatever gifts and opportunities you have to make life better for others, even when it's dangerous or difficult. In the face of one of history's most evil institutions, one small woman decided to fight back, and through her courage, determination, and faith, she helped bring down the entire system of slavery. That's what real badass looks like, not the loudest voice in the room, but the person willing to walk into danger again and again because others are counting on them. Sweet dreams, and may you have even a fraction of Harriet Tubman's courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. Her North Star still shines, guiding us toward a more just and compassionate world.